Hello everyone, hope you're doing well, no respawns here. So this is the first of my Warhammer 40k lore videos, this one focusing on the Dark Angels. Now as a side, this is the Dark Angels in their earlier period up to the end of the Horus Heresy, because there is huge shed loads of post-Heresy up to the 41st and 42nd current time lore that I will eventually focus on, but quite simply put, due to the new releases in the Warhammer 40k universe, and the fact that they're kind of pushing the narrative along quite far, I suspect we might get some huge changes within the Dark Angels, so I'm going to hold off doing kind of a post-heresy video until we've got some more stuff. But however, I'm going to be doing these videos weekly going forward, potentially even once I get a bit quicker at doing them and kind of get more of a rhythm in place and more comfortable with the style, potentially even doing 2 a week, but I doubt I'll do any more than that. Anyway, hope you guys enjoy this. I've spent a lot of time, it was good fun, but also, you know, bear in mind, this is my first lore video, so I'm training wheels, yeah? Training wheels. Anywho, so the Dark Angels were one of the founding 20 legions and bear the title of the First Legion. So this being that they're the obvious First Legion created by the Emperor of Mankind. And basically, that means for much of the early days of the Great Crusade, they were the most powerful, because obviously they were the first. They had the most equipment, they were the longer time to actually build up their forces. Now, before we get into the details and the history and all that jazz, I just want to describe why I like them. So for me, they are the epitome of the grimdark element of the 40k universe. So they merge this awesome feudalistic style with a kind of very dark science fiction. You know, they've got this kind of knightly orders, but with a typical 40k twist, which is why I love them. They're so cool. I also really like their successor chapters as well, because they follow this aesthetic. So, a note, the current meme narrative surrounding the Legion, is that they're secretly heretics, or rather, and I'm using sarcastic quotey hands here, totally loyal. This is due to the fact, and I'll get onto it a bit more detail later on, but the Legion experienced something of an internal rebellion when disgruntled members of the Legion led by Luther, the mentor and original right hand of their Primarch, Lionel Johnston, aligned themselves with secessionist elements, filthy traitors basically, within Caliban and declared independence from the Imperium. The resulting engagement, among other things, led to the destruction of Caliban, the disappearance of the Primarch, and began a 10,000-year hunt for their erstwhile brothers, so it was quite a mess, really. Before we get into how totally loyal they were, let's have a brief look of the history of the Legion and how they're definitely not traitorous Primarch the Lion. So the history is in 2 parts. So you've got the history of the Legion itself. That means prior to discovering and being reunited with the Primarch and coming to Caliban, and obviously the Primarch and Caliban as well. Obviously they merge, and then their history becomes one when obviously the reunification with the Emperor and his long-lost son. So before we get into the history of the Primarch and Caliban, let's talk about the Legion itself and why it was created. So as mentioned, the Dark Angels were the First Legion. They were created by the Emperor during the earlier days of the Crusade, and effectively became the template, or this is the fluff, says they were, on how other legions were based. This also led to the Legion developing kind of certain combat doctrines, because the other legions might be a little bit more specialized. The Dark Angels effectively covered all elements of warfare, but in a bit more of a weirder way. So their approach was to adopt 6 wings, each dedicated to a specific form of warfare. As a side, the name Wings was adopted when the Lion was unified with the chapter. We don't actually, the Legion rather, we don't actually know what these wings were called, but for the sake of this, we're going to refer to them as the Wings. So it's also to note as well, is only 2 of the wings still remain in the 41st millennium, but I will get to that later. So the first wing is the Deathwing. So this is made up of the most hardened and experienced members of the Legion who fight exclusively in tactical dreadnought armor, which, as you may know, is Terminator armor. Now, it's worth noting this first company differs from other first companies in the fact that they only fight in Terminator armor. So, for example, if you went to the first company of, say, I don't know, the Ultramarines especially, or someone like the Iron Warriors pre-Heresy, that kind of thing, they would be fighting in Terminator armor, but they would also sometimes fight in power armor when the need arose. For whatever reason, the Deathwing, they're all about that Terminator armor. And yeah, so it makes them quite cool, but also potentially tactically inflexible. Anyway, the second company is the Ravenwing. Now, the Ravenwing are a little bit more non-codex formation than the Deathwing, and like the Deathwing as well, they exist in the 41st millennium. It's also to note as well that they actually date back before the coming of the Emperor to Caliban, kind of. So the Ravenwing themselves are exclusively mounted, mostly on bikes, but also on other fast vehicles such as land speeders and Nephilim jet fighters. So as I said, they technically existed before the coming of the Emperor, mainly because the Order, which was the knightly order led by the Lion and Luther, were specialised in mounted combat. And a lot of them were called I think they were called the Black Knights or the Ravenwing. But basically, there was some suggestion that a full mounted force existed both within the Dark Angels Legion and the Dark Angels Calibanite, the Order. It's a little bit confusing, but basically they became the Ravenwing. They're also the more typical of the Dark Angels. They're kind of the more knightly elements, which is why I love the Ravenwing. Everyone loves the Ravenwing. But regardless of which one technically came first, they were renamed and formed into the Ravenwing proper. Now, again, there is also another huge element surrounding the Ravenwing and also the Deathwing, which is their relation to the Fallen. However, this is a little bit later down the line, and let's just get to the other wings first. Now, as mentioned, there were 4 other wings in the Dark Angels Legion. Now, in this instance, I do say Legion because they don't survive into the 41st millennium. So in the 41st and 42nd millennium, in the chapter The Dark Angels, the Deathwing and the Ravenwing are still around. However, the other 4 wings don't exist for whatever reason, and instead been replaced by your standard Codex lineup. However, before the adoption of the Codex, let's have a look-see and what the other 4 wings were. So you have, firstly, the Stormwing, who were, with little information we have, were mainly focused on void combat, so kind of leaning heavily towards assault squads and using boarding shields. And if you have kind of had a look on the Forge World website, they've got quite cool models using the standard boarding shields and shotguns. They look very, very cool. I don't know why they were disbanded. It might be, and you'll see this a lot with the other wings, where they were just adopted into the other more codex-orientated companies. However, they no longer exist. The second one is the Dreadwing, which is the wing of the Legion that can be just described as a necessary evil. So they brought less traditional methods to the fore when, the need arise. So utilising experimental weaponry, basically. So biological weaponry, chemical weaponry, radiation weaponry, and anything in between to achieve victory at any cost. As a side note, I kind of really, really like these guys and want them to make a comeback. Hopefully, considering Primarchs are popping up left and right, and Lion is hopefully going to be returning soon, perhaps he'll get nostalgic. So the next were the Iron Wing, who were a mechanized section of the Legion, who exclusively fought in land raiders and battle tanks. And again, you could kind of similar to the Stormwing, you can kind of see why these guys were abandoned, mainly because, you can just spread these heavier elements around the remaining companies rather than having them concentrated in one company. And finally, there is the Firewing, which, and who doesn't love major gaps in the lore, we don't actually 100% or even 2% know what their specialisation was. We know their name was the Firewing, but we don't know much else. However, as with all things, there's lots of guesswork. Now, there's kind of 2 distinct ideas on what they were. Some people seem to think, obviously, the name Firewing means that they assume they would use flame weapons. This is a tempting answer, Firewing, the other's called Iron Wing, all that jazz, but to be honest, I would put flame weapons more as a thing the Dreadwing would use, because it comes in the region of unconventional combat, or even something that's just spread out. I just can't imagine an entire section of one of the companies specifically aimed at flame weapons. They're not the salamanders. What I ascribe to the idea is that they're actually the Legion's artillery and siege specialists. Because if you look at the other 5 wings, there's not really a siege, bar maybe the Deathwing perhaps, and potentially bits of the Iron Wing, but Iron Wing are more mobile, so that's why I don't think Because you could say the Iron Wing were the siege company. However, because the idea they're mechanized, they're meant to be a bit more of a breaching unit, perhaps, maybe, you know, kind of smashing through enemy lines and kind of depositing their units rather than necessarily standing behind enemy lines, and, or rather behind your own lines and just bombarding them. So I tend to ascribe to the view that the Fire Wing are actually siege specialists, and where all the siege equipment of the Legion was kind of focused. Obviously, we don't actually know. I'm hoping later down the line this will be fleshed out into the future, and we'll actually get a solid answer on this. Now, as I said, these wings no longer exist in the current timeline, and there's no real indication of when they were abandoned. However, they're eventually replaced by the 8 companies, leading to 10 overall, that follow the standard Codex doctrine. So the Deathwing and the Ravenwing remain, however, and we'll get back to them later. As mentioned, the Dark Angels were used as the template and testing ground for what were later Legion's combat styles. Now, there isn't much in the way of direct quotes, you know, to attest whether this has actually happened directly. However, you can kind of see it. So, for example, you look at the Ravenwing, obviously there's lots of close links to the White Scars and how they fight the Dreadwing, and especially the Night Lords, and to a lesser extent the Raven Guard. But then you've also got the Iron Wing, potentially combined with the Fire Wing. It might have inspired how the Iron Warriors go about war. Now again, it's not 100% direct and clean cut, so in many cases how other legions are inspired by the Dark Angels is mostly conjecture. Now that was admittedly more on Legion organisation than necessarily history, but in the case of the Dark Angels, the both are quite linked and very important. Now, moving on to Caliban and the Lion himself, that's where things get a little bit more exciting. So, Caliban, first off, is classified as a death world. So, most of you who are familiar with 40k are familiar with the fluff surrounding death worlds. However, for the uninitiated, death worlds are as nice as they sound. So, they're basically worlds that are ostensibly a little bit too dangerous for widespread human settlement and colonization. However, obviously, people do live on them. The most famous death world is probably Katajan, and has the rather swole Katajan jungle fighters, who are a bunch of badasses. But however, death worlds are dangerous. Katajan is full of carnivorous plants, beasts, poisons, death everywhere. Now, however, Caliban is a little bit different compared to death worlds, in that, at least before its unfortunate destruction, effectively has its death world status sort of revoked. Not, I would gather, 100% completely, but basically this is because before it was destroyed, the main feature that made Caliban a death world were the beasts that roamed the forests, who were eventually hunted to extinction by the Order, which was led by the Lion and his mentor Luther. Well, prior to the extinction, the beasts were these chaos-warped monsters and the dominant kind of apex predators of the planet. And for the most part as well, these beasts are completely unique, so they're all very much kind of chaosy and a bit weird. There are a couple of exceptions, such as, if you've read the Descent of Angels book, the Calibanite Lion, who is killed by Johnston and then later Zahariah. So alongside the scary beasts, Caliban is also home to these strange, small, hooded creatures called the Watchers of the Dark. Now, there's very little information on kind of who or what they are, what their intentions are. However, in the current timeline of the 41st and 42nd millennium, they have a very special and close relationship with the Dark Angels chapter, and also how uniquely tied to the Lion himself. Now, again, with the way you want to look at Caliban is it's basically a big, dark, dingy forest world that's slightly infested with chaos. And that chaos taint becomes quite important later on and kind of contributes effectively to the destruction, but also, you could argue, contributes to the events and the interactions with the people. So anyway, the society of Caliban has regressed to a sort of techno-feudalism. So basically Game of Thrones, only with bolters and power armor, and arguably, I always think, more trees. Game of Thrones, bolters, power armor, and more forests. The land and the human populations are kept safe-ish, because don't forget this is a death world, by the various knightly orders that ruled over and protected them. So let's talk about the Primarch and of the First Legion, Lionel Johnston, commonly referred to as the Lion. Now, I'm not going to go into massive detail about his life, his upbringing, because there's a lot, as it could take a whole video in its own right, and obviously we're already getting quite in already, but I'll give you the abridged version. So basically, those you know, when the Chaos Gods scattered the infant Primarchs through the warp, Johnston's capsule actually landed on Caliban. However, unlike his brothers, who for the most instance landed at least somewhere near a human settlement, Johnston actually landed in the middle of nowhere. Now, as you can probably guess, most children would have died within short order when exposed to a planet like this. To be frank, actually any planet, but especially this one. However, obviously, this is a superhuman demigod Primarch we're talking about here, so Johnston not only survived infancy, but he also lived for 10 years like some sort of grim dark Mowgli, which is just an awesome image, and I would watch that version of Jungle Book straight away. However, Johnston eventually, probably should add, he wasn't actually called Johnston at this point, he's just, let's call him Grimdark Mowgli. So Grimdark Mowgli eventually encounters members of the Order, who are one of the major knightly orders, led on a hunt, and within that group, I always thought it was led by Luther. I did some further reading, it wasn't, I remember now, but basically alongside that hunt, or within that hunt, there was a knight called Luther. Sir Luther, I think they call it, rather than Sir Luther. Now, to the point where when the other knights saw this rather scary Grimdark Mowgli coming after them, they nearly tried to kill him. Obviously, they wouldn't have managed, but they did. They were thinking about it. However, Luther saw something, using sarcastic quotey hands here, and decided to bring him back to the fortress, where he was cleaned up, and eventually they named him Lionel Johnston, which translates to Lion, Son of the Forest, in kind of, I believe it's Low Gothic Calbanite. As a side, I still think Grimdark Mowgli is a much better name than Lion, Son of the Forest, so I'm going to call upon Games Workshop to now make that canon, or at least just make it one of his extra names. Anyway, so Grimdark Mowgli, now named Johnston, being a Primarch and superhuman in every way, grows up really fast, learns everything there is to know about the culture, and eventually would rise up to the highest position within the Order, with Luther as his close second. Now, it's worth kind of looking at the traits of Johnston right now, because he's quite an interesting lad. In terms of traits and characteristics, he's regarded as a master strategist. Obviously, a lot of them can claim that, and I believe the difference between Johnston as the master strategist and Horus as the war master is that Johnston is very much more about winning battles and maybe small wars in that kind of scale, whereas Horus is meant to be the guy who has the galaxy-wide strategy vision. I think that's the distinction between the two, because both of them are master strategists. However, on, I guess, a local level, Johnston will be better, and Horus will be better on a more galactic level. However, alongside this, he's not exactly a people person, and this can be largely blamed on his time alone when he was Grimdark Mowgli, but he means he struggles quite a lot with social interactions and tends to come across aloof and quite a bit distant. Now, this actually works quite well in a weird sort of way with the traditional secretive nature of the Dark Angels and the Order before him. However, it obviously does cause some rather major problems later on. It's also interesting now, did his character infer and make the Dark Angels that kind of, because they were always quite a secretive legion, to the extent where, for example, one of the reasons why the warrior lodges that, turned the likes of the Lunar Worlds, later sons of Horus, or made them more susceptible to chaos and allowed the word bearers to infiltrate them, just couldn't get set up within the Dark Angels because they were already quite secretive. So I'm curious. It's interesting whether both of the character of Johnston and also the character of the Order and later Legion, which one affected each one more, which is interesting. Anyway, so I made to cut a long series of events short. The Order, led by Johnston and Luther, launch a massive campaign with the other knightly orders, who quote, they do absorb actually within to their knightly order to wipe out the beast once and for all. Now this culminates in a pretty creepy, weird battle with a knightly order called the Knights of Lupus that results in the destruction of the beasts and the unification of the planet. Now I highly recommend you pick up the book Descent of Angels for this entire story. It really is quite good. I personally rate it as that and Fallen Angels as my two of my favourite Horus Heresy books, and the story is very, very cool. You know, it's very much kind of weirdly creepy in parts anyway. Anyway, so shortly after this, everyone's favourite God Emperor arrives and reunites with his lost son, and there is much rejoicing. So there are a few events that kick off that I'm not going to focus in because they're a little bit spoilerific for Descent of Angels, and they're not technically relevant. They are, but I don't need to specifically point to them. However, it's important to know that the arrival of Emperor is not particularly welcomed by everyone in the Order and the ruling, or now non-ruling, aristocracy of Caliban. But you think about it, as the bait beasts had only recently been destroyed, they kind of see the coming of the Imperium as restrictive and controlling, because they're kind of finding a position where they can grow their society. Effectively, at this point now, Caliban is no longer a death world, and then they're suddenly absorbed into this empire. So there is definitely a degree of empathy there, kind of, I guess, but also they're kind of dicks. So regardless of these reservations within the Order and the kind of the ruling aristocracy of the planet, the Dark Angels Legion is reunited with their Primarch, and he leaves with them to fight in the Great Crusade, and there is much fun. So loads of events during the Great Crusade that ultimately are less important than the overall story to the Dark Angels, but needless to say, they get to the important business of cleansing the Dark Galaxy with bolters and chainswords, all while looking very edgy and feudalistic, might I add, all in the name of the Imperium and the ultimate dream of unification of the galaxy under human rule. Now, when the heresy begins and it is in full swing, which I'm not going to do on the video of heresy right now, but I will do if people are interested later down the line, the Dark Angels are far away from the fighting. For those of you uninitiated, by the way, the Horus Heresy is this massive schism between the Space Marine legions, one led by Horus and one side led by the Emperor. It's massive, it's huge, but anyway, most of you know this. Right, so the Dark Angels of the Loyalist, and at this point, during where they are in the Great Crusade, they're far, far, far away from the fighting. But they make full steam towards Terra when they hear the news. Now, this journey itself is very long, and during this time, they were intercepted by the Night Lords under the direction of Horus and under the leadership of their Primarch, Conrad Kurz, which is basically two very angsty Primarchs meeting each other. It's a little bit awkward. So anyway, after 2 years, this resulted in a failed parley between the two legions, and unfortunately for the Night Lords, made them victim of a masterful ambush orchestrated by the Lion. Remember, he is a master strategist on a bit more of a local-ish level. And again, unfortunately for the Night Lords, they were actually attacked a second time, because when they were attacked the first time, Conrad Kurz, their Primarch, was eventually basically comatose, I believe. And they started infighting, because at this point, the Night Lords are the bastards full of bastard filling kind of chapter. So they were naturally going to try and kill each other. And while their two, I believe it's their first captain, Sevatar, is trying to kind of pull all the forces back together, naturally they get hit again. And what this eventually leads to, basically, is the Night Lords being effectively kind of removed as a coordinated threat to the Imperial forces. It's not to say they're not active, they're very active. However, they eventually kind of go into these kind of splinter raider parties rather than a coordinated threat for the remainder of the war. So after a couple of years of dicking around on the eastern fringe and playing around with his brother Conrad Kurz, the Dark Angels led by the Lion eventually do make it to Terra. However, their arrival is just shortly after the Ultramarines and the Space Wolves, which eventually prompted Horus to do his infamous bait of the Emperor, where he basically lowers the shield of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. This baits the Emperor over because he's got this perfect opportunity to finally take out his wayward son once and for all. The Emperor teleports over. This eventually resulted in a massive awesome battle that sadly left Sanguinius, everyone's favourite angel bro, killed, which also led to the Blood Angels going insane, but we'll get to that in another video. The Emperor is mortally wounded and later made kind of vaguely comatose, but not, and Horus is just destroyed utterly, like completely destroyed. He's gone, he's never coming back. Now, for most legions, this is where the bulk of the serious drama finished. Effectively, the Horus Heresy was over. Everyone got back to work, securing the Imperium as best they could, driving the traitor legions, who eventually fell back to the Eye of Terror. However, for the Dark Angels, not so easy, and the worst betrayal was much less to come. Later to come, rather. So, as mentioned earlier, the Emperor's arrival wasn't exactly welcomed by the aristocracy and some members of the Order back on Caliban, and this had led to quite serious seditious elements that take root and grow within Caliban. Don't forget, the Great Crusade was hundreds of years old, and this took, sedition would have been growing through generations. Obviously, some of the people who were actually leading the seditious elements were very, very wealthy, so obviously they had rejuvenation treatments that meant that they were living for this entire period. So to make matters even worse, because don't forget, this is Johnston we're talking about, and he's just socially inept, Luther, who was his right-hand man, and a portion of the Dark Angels had fallen out of favour with Johnston. Now this is another story. This is actually in the Fallen Angels book, and I won't let you know the exact details because it is quite interesting. But effectively, during the campaign at a place called Sarosh, this led to Johnston kind of effectively not trusting Luther at all anymore and sending him and his forces back to Caliban, ostensibly to overlook the training of new recruits, but it's kind of effectively they were banished from the Crusade forever, and this happened quite early on as well. They're having something like a good 100 years of these guys just stewing in their bitterness. Now I'd like to add here as well that Johnston, yes, due to his own upbringing, had some serious issues when it came to social interaction. Now, I'm going to just go out and say that what I think ultimately is his fault, but not that Luther isn't guilty as well. It basically, if another Primarch, if you replaced the Lion with someone a bit more friendly and better at socializing, like, for example, Vulcan, and the glorious bro that he is, you probably wouldn't have had this happen. However, basically, the way the chips fell, unfortunately for the Dark Angels and everyone involved, it did fall this way. So, again, as well, but it was ultimately Johnston's lack of empathy or understanding, reading the motivations of the people below him that kind of helped facilitate this series of events. Now, the events that happened during the betrayal are up for debate, of course. So what I mean by that is that there's the official kind of canon record, and then there's what the Fallen, notably Aslan, I believe he was one of the first, he's one of the most senior members of the Fallen, I always forget his actual rank, on who did what and who was the traitorous one. It's a little bit confusing. One of the reasons as well why in the original books by Gav Thorpe it was meant to be left a little bit vague, because on the side of what Aslan says is that Luther knew that Johnston was traitor and he was actually secretly loyal to the Imperium and was basically firing on this traitor who was going to, betray the Emperor again when he was weak. And obviously then the official story is that, which I'll tell you in a second. Take this with a pinch of salt. I think it's later been kind of reaffirmed, basically, that the Dark Angels were always loyal. A great example of this is kind of prior to some recent books. I believe it's the Unforgiven book in 2015. Basically, the Dark Angels, a lot of people seem to think they might go the way of the Astral Claws, who later became the Red Corsairs. The idea being that they were always slightly traitor and would teeter on the edge. That the motivation for this, which I'll get onto a bit, was potentially the idea of the Fallen would make them, kind of someone would discover their dark secret about this heresy. It's later reaffirmed by Chapter Master, or I believe it's Chapter Master Azrael, basically in the 41st millennium, that they've already decided him and the other Unforgiven chapters that basically if the Imperium at large would ever discover their secret, not a single shot would be fired and they would just lay down arms and accept whatever punishment. So basically, as much as the meme is they're super traitor, they're not really, but it's still a fun meme, so we can, you know, run with it. But anyway, tangent aside, as I said, so as mentioned, during the Great Crusade, the seditious anti-imperial elements had been allowed to fester and eventually resulted in a full-blown rebellion led by Caliban's former nobility as well as a cabal of Terran-born sorcerers that had actually infiltrated the world via the establishment of the Administratum, and that is very important, but I'll get to that in a sec. So there was Luther and the Dark Angels garrison. Now, they eventually did put down the rebellion and killed the sorcerers, but basically came to realise that Caliban itself was, by its very nature, tainted by chaos, and should the Emperor find out, they could face exterminatus. They also slightly blamed the Administratum for kind of being the catalyst for this, because these outside, you know, not one of us, basically, had effectively upset the balance on Caliban and forced these elements that the Calibanites had managed to control to come to the fore. And so this realization, combined with the years and years of bitterness at being abandoned by Johnston and left out of the crusade, led to Luther and the Dark Angels under his command to declare independence from the Imperium. Now, put note, the timeline of this is a little bit hazy, but this is technically still during the heresy, or like just at the end of it, but no one really knows. Now, this eventually no one really knows until this eventually comes to a head when the returning main Dark Angels fleet, led by Johnston, is immediately fired upon when they enter the atmosphere, well, enter the space surrounding Caliban by their planetary defenses. Now, at first, Johnston very, very confused, eventually catches wind from, I believe it's a kind of trading vessel going by. They interrogate them and they find out that basically Luther has declared independence as a complete filthy traitor. Now again, bear in mind this is Johnston we're talking about here, so someone who's, we've already discussed, pretty bad with people and also has some serious trust issues and just doesn't really get motivation. And again, that means that even potentially now, if you had someone like a Vulcan, screw it, even a pre-heresy Horus, you might have stopped what eventually happened. So Johnston rather, furious, his name is now Furious, furious at the betrayal and believing the planet has basically been completely lost to chaos and not wanting to be accused of heresy and what happened to the traitor legions happened to him, orders a systemic bombardment of Caliban. After laying waste to the planet's defences and basically just effectively glassing the thing, he led his forces to assault the fortress monastery where Luther and his remaining forces were dug in. Now, the Lion and Luther eventually meet within the fortress. Now, normally, nobody is the match for an incredibly pissed off Primarch, with the exception of potentially a tougher, incredibly pissed off Primarch. However, at this point, Luther had fully given himself over to the Chaos Gods and was far more powerful than he once was. Now, the battle's pretty vicious, it's very much a stalemate, but it ends with actually the Lion, Johnston, losing and being mortally wounded by a psychic attack. However, at this point, Luther effectively does a complete 180, collapses to the floor, has a complete breakdown, his mind is broken, he's realised what he's done, he just completely snaps, and he's just unwilling to fight. Now, unfortunately for Caliban, the planet, the damage was done quite badly, so a combination of the sustained vicious bombardment, don't forget, this is the entire Dark Angels fleet here, just pounding the planet, and then there was a massive warp storm sent by the Chaos Gods. Now, basically, there's a little bit more fluff to this, which I'll get into a second. So, obviously, this is the end of Caliban. The planet starts to break apart, it starts to crack. Now, yeah, for the most part, you would think that that's it. Everyone's going to die, that's it. All of the Dark Angels are dead. However, for starters, loads of them are actually in space anyway. But also, the Dark Angel's fortress actually has quite extremely powerful and vast void shields. The rest of the planet doesn't, so the rest of the planet just collapses and turns into a giant, basically, asteroid field. But the fortress actually survives, so it's this giant, massive fortress on a big floating rock now, and is ostensibly safe for the remaining Dark Angel's fleet to land on the asteroid and basically see what happens. So they find Luther ranting and raving, and no sign of Johnston. And also no sign of the remaining traitor Dark Angels as well. They'd be completely gone. What actually happened is they were scattered by the warp storm through time and space, and these eventually become the Fallen that leads to the hunt. The guys we know and love. Now, as on a side, there is some more fluff regarding the actual warp storm, and it surrounds the Fallen Angel Cypher with the scattering of the Fallen. So basically, it's due to the actions of Cypher and the Supreme Grandmaster Azrael in the 41st millennium. Azrael basically nearly changes the course of history and eventually changes his mind. However, their actions result in the scattering of the Fallen. It doesn't really relate to how the history is as it's perceived, and it's kind of a whole nother thing. So basically, it's a bit of a timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly kind of situation, but effectively it means that the Fallen were scattered maybe by the warp storm, maybe by a combination of the warp storm and later interference. Now basically this begins, anyway, the post-heresy period of the Dark Angels, which is largely dominated by that ongoing hunt for the Fallen, and their dedication to ensuring the secret of the destruction of Caliban is never discovered by the wider Imperium, and no one knows how definitely traitor they were, and instead know how totally loyal they are instead. Again, obviously it's a little bit of a meme, but they're a paranoid emo bunch, so what are you going to do? Now, as a side as well, of the Lion, the Dark Angels have no idea. They assume he's been killed or just obliterated, or they never find his body. However, the truth is a bit more interesting. So what actually happens is the Lion... So the Fortress Monastery of the Dark Angels becomes their new base, or their old base technically, but it's now in space. And it's called the Rock, right? And it's this massive, just giant asteroid spaceship. It's awesome. And inside the Rock, the Lion sleeps. So the Watchers of the Dark, you know, those little guys in the hoods, the guys who used to live on Caliban, they actually save the Lion and have been nursing him back to health for the past 10,000 years, or maybe he's just napping, we don't know. We assume he's being nursed back to health. And they're keeping him safe, but also hidden. No one can find him. He's right in the center somewhere, so you couldn't... somehow, if you got in there, wouldn't be able to find him unless they wanted you to find him. But also, Luther is actually still alive as well. However, he is known, not to the wider chapter. Basically, every single Supreme Grandmaster of the Legion, in this case Azrael, as the most recent one, knows of the existence of Luther, and will pass, upon choosing a successor, and I'm assuming his death, will pass the knowledge of Luther being alive to his successor. This is like the highest tier of secrecy and knowledge. And Luther basically is spending his entire existence now just ranting and raving about how basically the Lion will come back and absolve him and the Fallen. As a note, basically, the reason why that's important is when a new chapter master, Supreme Grandmaster rather, gets chosen, and he's led by the previous incumbent down to the crypts to meet Luther. They all try and get him to repent, but Luther is, no, I don't need to repent because Johnston is going to come and forgive me. This should actually come ahead quite soon, because as I said, currently in they're moving the narrative quite further along within the actual game. So, you know, obviously we've got Rebutes all alive and kicking. We've got, it is from time of recording. We've got, okay, the others were alive and kicking, but we've got Matarion, and we've also got Mangus, so my hope is that eventually the Lion will come back, and this story will move on. Considering how Cypher is actually quite big in the current lore, I'm expecting it will. So anyway, with its newfound obsession with the Fallen and distinct lack of Primarch, the Legion changes its organisation post-Heresy. So first, there's the second founding, ordered by Rabute Guilliman. So those who don't know what the second founding is, due to the massive size of the legions and how devastating the Horus Heresy was, Rabute, among other things, declares that no single legion can have that much power concentrated into one basically unit. So what they do is they chop all of the legions up into chapters, which means that basically instead of being like 30, 40, 50,000 Space Marines, you're 1,000. It's a bit confusing because I think, obviously because a lot of the legions had lost loads of their soldiers, because some legions are described as being like 50, 100,000 strong, but they're only chopped into a couple of chapters, so it's a little bit weird. I think it leaves it open to maybe for you to make up some second founding chapters if you want. But basically, anyway, the Dark Angels are chopped into 4 successor chapters, which are the Angels of Absolution, the Angels of Redemption, the Angels of Vengeance, and the Lion's Sable. As a note, the Lion's Sable are destroyed, I think it's somewhere in the 42nd millennium, but basically so the other 3 still exist. These legions these chapters together are referred to as the Unforgiven. Now, as a unique to the other legions who were split up into their subsequent chapters, these chapters still keep quite covert contact. This is the main reason for this is obviously for them to work together to hunt down the Fallen. It's not like they're not allowed to talk to other chapters, but I think the idea being is that the chapters were deliberately spread out so they don't have too much contact, whereas the Unforgiven are quite, at least for the inner circle, are very, very kind of irregular contact. Now, the second change of the Legion is, and as I mentioned, is the Circle. Now, the Circle did kind of exist, but it takes on a completely new meaning with the reorganization of the chapter, and it's much more about secrecy. So basically, once a member of the chapter becomes experienced and trusted enough, they are entered into the Inner Circle. This can be done in 2 ways, or technically 3, I think, but I will do the 2 first, which is leaving your current company and joining the Deathwing, which means you join and become, you know, some Terminator armored badass. And then the other way is if you're already part of the Raven Wing, but you join their veteran unit, which is the Black Knights. The Raven Wing, as I mentioned, are a little bit different, because weirdly enough, they almost operate like an almost mini chapter, effectively, because whereas other people in other, you know, Codex chapters, for example, you know, I'm in the 8th company, I become a veteran, I'm going to join the 1st company, I'm not gonna, whereas in the Raven Wing, you stay within the Raven Wing, you just become a Black Knight. However, your actual duties change, so basically members of the Deathwing and the upper echelons of the Raven Wing are charged with hunting down the Fallen. It gets a little bit complex in terms of making sure the people who aren't initiated don't discover the dark secrets. Because basically, if you're outside the Inner Circle, you know nothing of the Fallen whatsoever. At all. You think everything's good. I don't think they have an established canon on what they tell everyone about the destruction of Caliban, that it was destroyed by Horus, I believe, is the current stick. However, once you're entered the Inner Circle, you then learn the truth about the Fallen. However, it's worth noting, within the Inner Circle, there are layers of truth. So, for example, I believe when you enter the Inner Circle, you assume the Fallen are dead. For example, there might be a few left, and you know more and more until you become Supreme Grandmaster, and you realise that, oh god, I've got to talk to Luther in a minute. It's also a note as well that the chaplains are members of the Inner Circle as well. Kind of. They have interrogator chaplains. The reason being is that the interrogator chaplain's role is to actually get the Fallen to repent. As a side note as well, it's quite an interesting tidbit, but basically once they've managed to get one of their Fallen to repent, they actually get a new bead to go on their rosary. So I was going to say, if you ever see a chaplain with 3 or 4 black beads on his rosary, then you know he's a badass. But then I realised this is all fiction, so you probably won't. But basically, yeah, so the main goal is to capture and get the Falling to ideally make them repent, but executing them is a close second. And that about covers it for the Dark Angels. This is already, you know, a 40-minute plus video, so as you can see, even though I've not really gone into massive detail in terms of kind of really specific elements of the chapter history, I've kind of given you as much of a broad from start to, well, finish, or rather current, as they are right now. But they're very, very cool, very, very grim dark, or the Dark Angels. Lots of dodgy dealings, but lots of sneakiness. I loves it. But they've also got this awesome feudalistic badassery, and also, as you said, they're led by Grimdark Mowgli, whom we love so much, even if he's a little bit socially inept. My overall idea and my overall opinion of the Dark Angels, I know I said the meme is that they're, you know, totally loyal. However, realistically, they are loyal. Basically, they're just a little bit secretive. I said, I think maybe Gav Thorpe, the author who kind of first started the meme, or started the kind of the suggestion, or maybe they're slightly traitorous, is slightly regretting it now, because it does make them a little bit more complex. Whereas now they've gone, no, they're loyal. Shut up, unless it's all conspiracy. We don't know. Anyway, hope you guys like that. I'm going to do more of these. I'm going to get better at doing them, specifically scripting them. I script them slightly, but not quite. Kind of basically still keep it a little bit more chatty. If you like that, let me know. If you want something a little bit more sterile and, you know, bullet pointed, here's what's happening, let me know, and I'll try and do stuff like that. Probably just merge the two and make everything a little bit tighter. I've got a few ideas of what the next videos are going to be. These will be weekly going forward, so on the weekend. This one is probably not going to go on the weekend, but the next one will. Anyway, until that time, you guys enjoy your week, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.